So to install the rear flotation tank bulkheads, it's going to be done in about 2 or 3 different stages. First off was to glass the panels and scuff them all up. I'm just going to scuff an area on the side, inside the rear bulkhead here, so we get a good bond. All the rest is pretty well sanded where the epoxy is going to go. And the process is going to be to install what is referred to in the manual as a blind fillet. In other words, we're going to put this panel in. However, the underside has got packing tape on the 3 sides where the fillet is going to go. We're going to place it in, hold it in place, tip the boat on its edge, run a fillet along these 3 sides and let it harden. But what we'll end up being able to do is to take this lid off, and there will be a little, kind of like a cleat made out of thickened epoxy along here for the lid to rest onto. So let's get started on that. So to hold the lid in place, we can place it in, get all of the tongues fitting into the slots nicely and really pushed in tightly into the corner. Then I'm just going to use some glass fiber reinforced tape to just really nicely tightly hold this lid down. First down to the bulkhead, pushing down. Got to cut this tape with a utility knife, or in this case I'm just using a little blade, pushing it in, taping it up. I'm going to have to tip this boat on its edge so I can get in there and run the fillet. I'm going to hold this to the back as well. It's into the corner nicely. This tape will not tear without being cut, but it sticks really nicely to an epoxy coated surface and doesn't come loose, even with a bit of dust on the panel itself. Okay, so they're held in there well enough that tip the boat on its edge, they're not going to fall out. Okay, so I mixed up my epoxy using a slow cure to give myself a good amount of working time, because it's going to be a bit of a tight corner in there. I don't know if I'll be able to get a camera in there, but it's pretty straightforward creating the fillets. So there's my mix. I don't want it too runny because my plan is to do one side, put the boat back down on the dolly, turn it around and lean it up the other way so I can do both sides. I'm not fond of the putting the filleting blend into Ziploc bags, so again I'm going to use the West System 810 empty cartridges, and we're just going to feed it all into there. There's more than enough here to do those fillets. It would be nice if the consistency was enough to pour in there, but then I'm worried that the fillets themselves will just run out. So I can maybe put this into here and feed it all into here. It's a pretty warm day out here right now. It's about 75 degrees in the shop. I can actually feel the epoxy already warming up, even though it is a slow cure. West System 207. I don't really have much use for 209 hardener. It doesn't usually get that hot that I need that much working time, but there are days when you really have to only mix up little batches because it's just going to kick off on you way too fast. But once I squirt this out into the fillets inside the boat, process of curing is going to slow down. Just want to get it all in here because you really aren't going to get the cap back out and refill this tube. So I want to make sure I have enough in there on the first go around to do the job. Okay, we're just going to get the cap in here. They are definitely a bit tricky to get them in there, but it needs to be tight so it's not squeezing out the wrong end. So I don't have a mess everywhere. And then we're going to find everything on this dirty bench. I want a good sized fillet in there, so I'm going to cut this off. And we're ready to go. All right, the moment of truth. Pray that little bits of epoxy haven't squeezed out somewhere and glued this puppy in place. So with the packing tape around the edges, it should just come off. Of course, we just have to be able to maneuver it out with the tongues that are sticking into there, and there you have it. So with the lid removed, we've got the blind fillets on the side here, which we can just clean up. And once we have the medial portion of the flotation tank wall in, then the lid will literally just be glued down to there, and then there'll be fillets running around on that, around the top edge as well. So we've got a bit of squeeze out here I'm going to have to clean up so that these will go in. But it's pretty straightforward. As long as you've got good packing tape onto these edges, these panels will come out. So it looks like I've got a little bit of epoxy sticking somewhere. I don't want to just break it off. I'm going to tear some wood. So what I've done is I've heated up an old utility blade here, and I'm actually able to just kind of knife that through there, and off she pops. So I've cleaned up a bit of the fillet edges there so they don't get cut, and then we need to sand all the edges inside the panel for a good bond of epoxy all around the three sides, and also on the forward wall here as well. Do both sides, dry fit them in. Happy with all the fitting, everything goes together nicely. We're ready to tape it in place and fill it around the inside. And with both side panels taped in place, now it's time to run a fillet on the inside of all the panels, on the bottom edge and up both ends. On both sides, and then we'll let that cure, and then the lid can go on. fillets inside the flotation tank don't really need to be that tidy. No one is ever going to see in here, but we just want to make sure that it's a good corner bead and a good bond to both the bottom panel of the boat and the panel on the side of the flotation tank. So moving on to the next day, with the fillets all held in place and all the side walls in the flotation tanks in place, it is now time to glue down the lid. So I'm just mixed up a whole batch of thickened epoxy, and I could just brush it onto here, but I want to make sure there's a good dab, a good dollop. It's going to squeeze out everywhere and have a good bond between the lid and all of the blind fillets that are in there and the cleat that's attached to the middle panel. So as you can see, I have prepped all the surfaces with 80 grit sandpaper, cleaned up all the shine on the blind fillets before pressing the lid down onto the top of the box. And to hold it all in place, we're just going to tap in a few nice finishing nails through the top panel into the edge of the vertical sidewalls. Doesn't need a lot of pressure to hold it down, a lot of squeeze out, and this will all be glassed as well later. And I had a little bit of thickened epoxy left over, so I figured I might as well just utilize it, put it in a syringe and inject it into some of the gaps between the panels and the transom and the shear strake on the sides. I'm not filleting at this time, just going to fill the gaps. So with the rear flotation tanks all glued in place, it's time to just reinforce the edges with a couple of strips of fiberglass. Here I'm just using some 4-ounce cut from the end of the roll. I'm just going to put a little epoxy onto the area where the strip is going to go, and then we can just stick them in place and add some more epoxy. The edges of the plywood will want to soak up a little bit extra, so we'll make sure that it's well saturated there. I'm going to start with the upper edges first, and then I will add the vertical strip last. I'm not going to try and get anything to wrap around any compound corners, just around the two edges. So with those done, I may just come back and touch up a little extra on the edges of the epoxy here, or of the panels themselves, as again they will want to soak up a little extra. It's all been sanded, rounded over nicely, so that there will be no sharp edges for bubbles to form. So let's start with the longest one here. Trying to evenly space it over the joint and just kind of sticking it in place. Second piece goes here. Third piece will come up. I'll actually wait for that piece to go on. A bit of an overlap on the corner there, but that'll all be sanded down. Now I'm just going to come back and kind of dab on a bit more. Saturate the glass nicely. I could use a small roller section, I suppose, but I find with small pieces of glass it tends to just grab it and lift it. When I dab too much, you can kind of add a lot of air to the epoxy and foam it up. Makes it difficult for a clear finish if a lot of air is trapped into the epoxy. More than enough on there now. Let it sit. So those two there, just add the third piece running vertical. This piece I'll just leave it sticking up proud, not going to try and fold it over, it's not necessary. I could add some pieces of peel ply as well, hold it down, but I find I actually get a clear finish without the peel ply. So it's apply the glass, coat, saturate, remove excess, get a second coat on several hours later, let that harden up for a couple of days, sand it all fairly smooth, edges feathered in, and then with 2 more coats rolled on, you will not see this piece of glass. So this is 4 ounce, cut from the end of the roll, and it will clear up quite nicely. Okay, I think we got it all saturated. Well, let's let that sit there for a minute. We'll come back and smooth it out. So now that that's sat there, all the glass is cleared, I'm just going to very simply squeeze off a little bit of excess, pushing the glass down nicely onto the wood. So it's going to want to run down the faces if there's too much excess epoxy, and I also don't want to have to clean it up later with epoxy runs that need to be smoothed out. So the point is to pay attention, smooth everything out, get rid of the excess. Once the glass is cleared, that's all the epoxy it needs. So there's a few spots where you can see some bubbles on the edges here. Just can dab them back in. The tiniest little air bubble now may not be visible, but under varnish it's really going to show up out in the sunlight. So may have to come back a few times here as it starts to set up and just keep pushing it back and dabbing it in. So after a couple of days, I've sanded down all of the rough edges of the fiberglass seam tape on the rear flotation tanks here. And now today I'm just going to quickly brush on and roll out 2 more coats of epoxy to blend those seams in. And then the last will be to just add the fillets to the top edge around the edges here and down the sides. I'll brush it on, that just gets it in place. And then I'll use a roller to smooth it out so there's no drips and runs. don't want to have to do too much sanding again. So after rolling, I'll just take a cheap chip brush and just kind of tip it off. The roller kind of tends to leave a bit of a rough surface, little bubbles and all. So, and you can reuse these brushes. I mean, it doesn't soak up that much epoxy. So, used to be about this long. I tip off tomorrow, just cut off a little of the excess bristles, and you can get multiple uses out of that brush. So while that epoxy is setting up, I can come in with a syringe and fill it all the corners that have not already been done. And the last task will be to just take my 1-inch fillet stick, clean up these corners, then the chisel stick to clean up any excess. Put another coat on later today, let that all harden. She's ready to be lightly sanded and varnished. And again, thank you to all my subscribers for watching this and other builds at orcaboats.ca. Be sure, if you're not already subscribed, to hit that subscribe button and click that little bell so you'll be notified of any new videos. Next up, we'll be making the forward seating arrangement and installing that.